anti-Semitism. It's a shape-shifting virus. Assimilate, don't assimilate, still get anti-Semitism. If you're poor, get anti-Semitism. If you're rich, you get anti-Semitism. If you have no influence, you get anti-Semitism. If you have lots of influence, you get anti-Semitism. You don't have a state, you get anti-Semitism. If you have a state, you have anti-Semitism. I also feel that one of the things that always happens with this country in war is that it is subjected to unbelievable lies, and also, on a simple level, unfairness. And I do mind at a very deep level about fairness. And when I see much of the reporting, in fact, I'd say even most of the reporting in the international media about conflicts involving this country, it's not just that it's untrue very often, but it's just wildly unfair. To take the example of the current conflict, if a similar battalion-sized attack had attacked the United States on the 7th of October, by proportion of population, that would have involved the murder of about 120,000 Americans. I don't think America would have glossed over that easily or fast. And I don't think that people would have said by the Sunday, I wonder what the American response is going to be. I hope it's not disproportionate. I think they would have allowed the Americans to have done whatever they felt they needed to do to get revenge, to level the playing field, and what's more, to win. Because one of the things I've felt for many years about conflicts in this country is not just the unfairness of coverage, but the persistent demand that if Israel fights the conflict, it's allowed to fight a little bit, but never to win. And I want Israel to win.
I understand that you witnessed the uncensored October 7th footage with other journalists. Why did you feel it was important to watch it?
Well, I wasn't actually wild about watching it because I've seen plenty of unpleasant things in real life in conflict zones. So I didn't feel that, as some journalists did, that, let me test myself and see if I can see the horror, which I think some people didn't do, know what these things look like. But I was asked as it happened, I was in New York when 7th of October happened. On the 8th, I went down to Times Square because I learned that there was a pro-Palestinian protest, which of course wasn't a pro-Palestinian protest. It was a pro-massacre protest because, first of all, people were carrying posters celebrating the massacre. And secondly, because this was the 8th, people were still being killed in the south of Israel. And you have an anti-Israel protest then, give us 24 hours to mourn, at least. So anyhow, but then I had some obligations of speaking. I was doing speaking tour with Jordan Peterson around Europe and ended up in London just as the Israeli ambassador said, we're doing a screening and we'd like you to be there. So I hardly so much admire ambassadors. I went. And, what did I learn from it? I actually did learn one thing from it, which most people talk about, the appallingness of the video, which doesn't need to be elaborated on. It's as bad as it could be. But I did learn one thing, which is something I've said occasionally in newspapers and on media. I actually said it in the Jewish Chronicle in London in a piece, which then caused a terrible stink for the Jewish Chronicle because people pushed back against it. But I said that there is actually one thing which stood out to me, which was the glee of the murderers, the glee of the terrorists. And I actually said afterwards, I said, when I walked in silence for a long time down Kensington Palace Road. A great friend of mine is a seasoned journalist in his 70s. And eventually, when we did speak, we said the same thing. It's the glee. I've seen the Russian way of war. It's very, very brutal. And there are psychopaths in the Russian army, but it's not an entire army of psychopaths. This was an entire army of psychopaths, sociopaths, you might say. And an Israeli psychotherapist actually was on a panel with me last night, and she made the important observation that she worked in Sderot, and she said, remember, psychopaths are born, sociopaths are made. Really dealing with is a society of sociopaths. But anyway, I made the point from there that the bit that a lot of people try to push back on, but I stand by, which is that this in no way minimizes the atrocities of Nazis. Who could do that? But there was one layer, which was that although some Nazis were very proud of their work, even Himmler said when he gave the instructions to the SS and others, you're doing something that will have to remain between us. It has to be secret. It will be done in secret, and it must never be talked about. Of course, some Nazis were very proud of their work and so on. But you didn't have an entire army of people who would have, if they lived, even if they'd lived in our age of social media and iPhones and everything else, called back to their parents in Hamburg and said, "I'm so proud of my work. You should be so proud of your son." And as it happened, a great late friend of mine in London who died some years ago, a great man called George Whitenfeld, who was, among other things, a refugee from Austria in 1938, and was also Chaim Weizmann's secretary at the Foundation of the State of Israel. He, towards the end of his life, he died at the age of 96, about 8 years ago. He, at the end of his life, said this to me. He said maybe it was better coming from him, who had fled Nazism. But he said this. He said that the pride of Hamas and the Islamic fundamentalist groups is a sort of another tier of evil. It doesn't mean that what Hamas has achieved on a scale is what the Nazis set out to do. But in temper, it is different, and very disturbingly so. So I learned that from the raw footage, if nothing else.
So one of the many narrative battles that has been raging recently is this idea of this question of when did this conflict start? Did it start on October 7th, or is there extra context that we need to understand? So when did the conflict start?
You know, there was a debate some years ago in London that I was at, and my friend, the historian Andrew Roberts, was debating. It was a debate about the origins of the Second World War as a temper. He had Pat Buchanan, a sort of somewhat dinosaur-like figure in American politics, on the other side. And there was some incredibly tedious academic, as it happened, at Churchill College, Cambridge. And they were doing all that stuff that modern academics who don't know what they're talking about do, and they get sort of mired in totally facetious and frivolous and unimportant details until you actually realize they didn't know. There was an argument over why the Second World War started, and eventually the moderator turned to my friend Andrew Roberts and said, "Why did World War II start?" And Andrew said, "World War II started because Hitler invaded Poland." That was helpful, you know. And sometimes that happens in discussions, and particularly academic discussions, high-level discussions. People get so lost in the intricacies that they forget the basics. Now, obviously, this conflict started on October the 7th. It's not true that there was a ceasefire on October the 6th. The people of Ashkelon, Ashdod, Sderot don't believe that they were in a ceasefire before October the 7th. But it wasn't this, and they knew that the scale of what they were attempting to achieve was of a different order. So they started this, and my hope is that it's Israel that finishes it. But of course you can add masses of context, and the problem with that is you can keep going back and back, and eventually it becomes a sort of rather onanistic intellectual exercise. No, this started in 2005, 2006, or this started with this. It started in 1948. No, it started with the Balfour Declaration. No, it started with the Ottomans. You know, you could. This is a region where you can keep going back and keep going back for an awfully long time. You might say it started in 2005 with the withdrawal. I remember the withdrawal very well. I remember the arguments about it very well. I just came back from Gaza again today, and I'm still somewhat covered in dust, but I was in a few weeks ago again, and I spoke to a commander of the IDF. We were just up from the Shifa hospital, and I said to him, I suppose in his 50s or so, I said to him, "Have you been here before?" We were standing in the middle of the Gaza Strip. He said, "Yes." I said, "When were you last here?" He said, 2005, when I was tearing family friends out of their houses. 18 years later, here I am again. The Gazans have had think about 18 years. That's the length of time of an education. They had exactly the time of an education. And they've given us this, a society of sociopaths. So it's their fault. They started that. Their fault. And they have to pay for it.
Neil Ferguson recently said that American universities are, quote, engaged in precisely the same processes that led the great German universities down the path to complicity in the Holocaust. Now, according to Ferguson, this was largely due to the politicization of higher education. What do you think about the current state of education in Europe and North America?
Well, I think it's totally lamentable, as I've already slightly pointed out. I'm not trying to bash America in particular, it's just I'm afraid that in our time, and I wrote a book about this some years ago called The Madness of Crowds, we have had this very strange development of one of the worst thought viruses for some years coming out of America, particularly from the American universities in recent years. And you all know what it is. People call it different names: social justice, ideology, intersectionality, one of the worst, ugliest words in the language that describes an even uglier idea. Hierarchies of oppression, narratives, all of this. All of this, by the way, can be pulled apart very easily. I don't think any of this is an academic discipline. I don't even think it's an idea. Certainly not an idea that sustains any serious contention. What has happened is that ideology, along with all this sort of diversity, equity, inclusion as a priority, all of that is being mapped onto the Middle East at the moment. And much of the sort of misunderstanding, I mean, some is just evil activists who hate this country and wish for it to be destroyed. And one shouldn't gloss over those people too fast, but that exists. But below them is just this large number of people, as I say, particularly in America, who, because I say America used to be a net importer of bad ideas, principally from France. And I'm serious, I mean, it was French theory. French theory went to America. America turned it through the race spin cycle and sent it back to the rest of the world. And it's so bad that the French don't want it. They literally, 100 academics the other year signed a letter saying, we do not want this in France. Emmanuel Macron, no right-winger he, said the same thing. He said, we don't want this. It doesn't fit our society. And in fact, when the great iconoclastic purge of 2020 occurred in the US, where everyone started pulling down statues of almost everybody, when that happened, Macron said, not one statue will come down in France, not one monument. I hugely admired him for that. Our past, we will keep our past. We will know about our past. After all, how are you going to know about your past if everything in your past has been taken down? There was an American scholar who recently said, I don't want to see statues of Civil War, Confederates. So I want to be able to go through my country and learn about my country without seeing this. You think, how are you going to learn about your country if you only have like a tiny sliver of its history? I was recently in, Richmond, Virginia, to give a speech, and they have a place there called Monuments Avenue. Monuments Avenue used to be a rather beautiful avenue. It was filled with rather contested figures, it has to be said, including General Robert E. Lee, the commander of the Southern Forces in the Civil War, who was, by the way, I mean, he was on the wrong side, but he was a very remarkable man. And they've taken down all of these monuments now. So Monument Avenue is now just Plinth Avenue. And the only statue that stayed standing is one of Arthur Ashe, the tennis player. Am I right? Yeah. It was a black tennis player. It's a rather unfortunate statue, by the way, because it's him holding a tennis racket like this and a young child kneeling at his feet. And it looks like he's just going to whack it. Very bad sculpture. But if you go to Monuments Avenue now, you'd think that the history of Richmond, Virginia was one of tennis playing, which is somewhat misleading idea. But this American social justice, intersectionality, victim hierarchy thing, they've all just imposed on this region. And that's why they've gone so wildly astray. You know, they look at this region, they go, they know that colonialism is bad. They think that colonialism is bad, always and everywhere. They think that, well, white people are bad, obviously. They think that everything is oppressor, oppressed. And by the way, the oppressor is always the oppressor, and the oppressed is always the oppressed. And you can guess them just by looking at them, from the facile view of our species. There we go. And they've placed this onto Israel. They've decided, among other things, that Israel is a white, they've never been here, a white colonialist enterprise in which the Israelis are the oppressors and the Palestinians are the oppressed. And this is such a facile view, but it has caught hold. Now, what Neil Ferguson points out in that piece that he wrote for Barry Wise's Free Press was that, of course, first of all, universities are not necessarily places of moral improvement. And it's not necessarily the purpose of the university. My view is that the university should be there to educate and to make cultivated people. But it's not necessarily the case that because you go to university, you become a good person. In fact, probably all of us have encountered people who have never been to university or have never had any education to speak of and are the nicest, kindest, most generous, loving people you could imagine. And I'm sure all of us have met highly qualified SHITs. And it's just not the case that the university is morally improving. And the point that Neil made, among other things, was that was the case in the 1930s in Germany. One of my great intellectual heroes, Alan Bloom, who wrote The Closing of the American Mind, when he traced what he believed went wrong in the universities, he wrote his masterpiece in 1984 or so. So we've known about this for all my lifetime, and it's just got worse. He points out that in Germany, the great intellectual catastrophe happens when Heidegger, who was then the rector of Heidelberg, gives the Rektoratsrede in 1934. And in this chilling speech to the students at Heidelberg says, all of the questions have been settled, and now it's just our job to implement them. Well, the students at Heidelberg did not get a moral education in that period. And the point that Neil was making was, without saying this is all as bad or just the same or anything, is it's the same now in some way. You know, we have students going to university who are being made actually morally worse. And everybody in America knows this phenomenon. I think you can buy yourself a bit more time in British universities now, and at some universities on the continent for sure. But, you know, for years I've said that, you know, these poor parents in America is getting, not everywhere, but in many places, these poor parents, you know, remortgage their house to send their children away to university to become stupider and malevolent, which doesn't seem to me a good bargain. But yes, I mean, it starts off with that. I mean, who are these people, the presidents of universities, to start claiming about morality and conflict, or which side you should be on? Educate the damn students. Give them their money's worth. It's a lot of money.
I think by now, most of us have seen the videos in the congressional hearing in which the heads of Ivy League universities just simply refuse to answer the basic question: is calling for the genocide of Jews violating their code of conduct? Now, almost immediately there were calls for resignation, but many of the people who are criticizing the university presidents are the same people who for years have been advocating for the freedom of expression on campuses. As someone who's written extensively on freedom of expression, where do you draw the line?
The line is so clear. This is just not a complex question. I do think on almost any question you can drive people to a level of insanity by drilling down repeatedly on the same question. But let me put it this way, you know, one thing that societies like Britain, where I'm from, have in recent years been going through this societal breakdown over who are we? Who are we? What are we? What is our society? What is Britishness? What is it to be British? What does it mean? And I always say, first of all, that that's a bad sign, because if you have to ask, it means you're in trouble. And secondly, if you do that to any person, as well as to any society, for long enough, you will cause a kind of breakdown. I mean, if I said to any of you, you know, but who are you? And you told me your name. I said, no, but who are you? No, but okay, I know you're the daughter of X and Y, but who are you? If I kept going like that, you would have a breakdown at some point. You would have like, I don't know anymore. Enough with the questions. So well, you can kind of keep drilling down on some questions and actually just make it worse and worse by keeping on answering it. The free speech one, I say this with some irritation, but we've known the basic rules of this for 400 years. And so when people say to me, what are the limits of free speech? I just say, do you know the work of John Milton? Have you read John Stuart Mill? Do you know that this has been settled for 200 years? And if you don't know the answer, it's your darn fault. And you, to use one of the phrase of the time, need to educate yourself. It is not the fault of free speech that you are ignorant about free speech. It's your fault. Now, in our societies, of course, it differs country to country. Some countries still have sort of blasphemy-like laws. Some countries have the First Amendment. Some countries have sort of lèse-majesté laws. Funnily enough, Germany actually does. Something I found out some years ago when I got in trouble with President Erdogan, because it was a rather long story. But anyway, a German comedian was rude about him, and he tried to get Merkel to prosecute the comedian for a lèse-majesté law, which is pretty amazing. I promptly started a competition with £1,000 cash prize to insult President Erdogan, which is why I can't go to Turkey anymore. Growing lists of countries that are not welcome. But there is always a difference country to country, but broadly speaking, it is really quite straightforward. Most people agree, or have agreed, that freedom of speech is absolute, with a couple of exceptions. And the main exception is incitement to violence. And the level that our societies have for incitement to violence is very specific. For instance, it does not include misgendering someone. It does not include saying that biological sex is real. It does not include hurting someone's feelings. It does not include being mean or nasty. You know, we're not a kindergarten, or not meant to be. And actually, even within incitement, it is pretty specific. As somebody who's lived in this sphere for quite a long time, for instance, if somebody fires off a message from their mother's basement saying, "I want to kill you," I don't regard that as incitement. I regard somebody standing outside my house with a mob with flaming torches saying, "Go into that house," as incitement. But it's a pretty high bar, actually. Some years ago, because we live in an age of victimhood, or at least we do in the West, where the person who's most victimized wins. Some years ago, there was a diver called Tom Daley in the UK, and somebody sent a tweet out saying, "I want to drown you." And he was arrested by the British police, and I actually stood up for the young guy. I said, first of all, this is really, clearly, when you looked into the case, very ill, very unhappy young man living in a Borstal hostel home in the south of England, miles away from anywhere that Tom Daley the diver was performing, and also that it's very hard to drown Tom Daley. And I thought all of this should be taken into account. But of course people go, "Oh, it's a death threat, it's a death threat." It's really very specific. Free speech are broken. And I am pretty absolutist about this. And I am in favor of a very, very wide range of expression. What the heads of the three formerly good institutions were doing was, first of all, showing an incredible moral gap that they have. Because, as many people, including myself, pointed out, if you inserted any other group of people in there, is calling for the killing of all black people acceptable at Harvard? I think they could have done it like that. Is calling for the murder of all gay people something you encourage at Harvard? Like that. Genocide of Jews? Context. I have a friend who knows more than me about technology, and I happened to comment in an interview that the three women sounded to me like ChatGPT when they answered questions. They wrote out these stupid formulaic legalistic answers. I know why, of course. They were legal answers designed to cover their backsides from any future legal action taken by a student, specifically a Jewish student. That's why particularly the head of the University of Pennsylvania, who sort of smirked her way through the answers, and one of the reasons I particularly detested her answers, she sort of smirked. And I looked at that smirk, I thought, what is that smirk? And it's a smirk of somebody getting away with something they know is a bit wrong. But I said to this, a friend of mine phoned me up and said, "Douglas, you're wrong about the ChatGPT thing." He said, I've just tried typing in these questions and ChatGPT gives a good answer. And so we did it together, where we had is it okay to call for the genocide of Jews? ChatGPT's answer is, in all moral systems, genocide is deemed to be wrong. Well, Claudine Gay of Harvard couldn't say that. So as I said, it turns out that the AI is more moral than the president of Harvard. Well done, Harvard. So no, I mean, of course I defend freedom. By the way, also all these people who weren't for freedom of speech are crying freedom of speech. And it's a total phony. It's a crock. Because all of these universities have disinvited speakers in recent years who have done nothing like calling for genocide. Mike Pompeo was meant to give, the former Secretary of State in the US, was meant to give a speech at one of these campuses a few years ago and told me himself, and he's now written it in his memoir, that he was disinvited because the university was concerned that he was going to say things that would offend the Chinese Communist Party. So don't give it to me that Mike Pompeo is not able to come to campus because he might insult communists. But genocide of Jews, freedom of speech, too complicated. It's really complicated. These people weren't practicing that for years. They're total phonies and frauds.
I want to ask, first of all, thank you so much for coming. I want to ask, you discussed how so much of Israel's military activities are contingent on the international community, and particularly the United States, what they approve of or don't approve of in terms of military action. Do you think that it should be a goal of Israel to eventually wean off of this support? I know that this has been something on my mind for a long time, just a concern in that regard of the U.S. controlling all of Israel's military interests and actions dependent on aid. And if they would succeed in that regard, do you think that that would have a meaningful effect in terms of Israel being able to operate more in terms of Israel's direct interests as opposed to the interests of the international community?
Well, it's true that it would be enormously helpful if Israel wasn't reliant on US support. I think the sort of low points in the Obama administration, obviously, this country was looking for friends elsewhere as well. There are all sorts of things one could say about that strategy, but it seems to me wise at least to look around if your main ally looks like they're going soft on you. And ideally, Israel would be self-sufficient in this regard. I don't know what scenario get Israel to that situation, but obviously that's most desirable. Anti-Semitism is such a complex subject that I can't do justice to it in a few minutes, but it seems to me that you can tell somebody who's never thought about anti-Semitism. You can tell it when they say something like, that's why we must eradicate anti-Semitism forever. Jeremy Corbyn, the former leader of the Labour Party, no friend of Israel, would occasionally demonstrate his unfathomable ignorance by saying things like, that's why we must, I mean, he's a horrible anti-Semite as it happens, but he would occasionally say things like, when cornered, he'd say, we need to defeat anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, racism of all kinds. And he's just going, you haven't thought about any of this for a minute. I mean, that's like saying, that's why we need to have a war on envy and eradicate envy from our societies. Or avarice. How about gluttony? My favorite thing, and well, it's like two books, if I may, that seem to be primers on the question of anti-Semitism. One is a book that was introduced to me by Thomas Stoppard a few years ago, which was a book with a rather lurid title, Confessions of an Anti-Semite, by a great Romanian-born writer, Gregor von Rensori. And he wrote this great book, which is actually a set of 5 short stories, but it's set in pre-First World War Middle Europe. And the opening chapter in particular has a very striking scene. It's about just the anti-Semitism that was around before the catastrophe, that was just around in the Habsburg world. And there's an incredible scene where the young man, or the young Austrian, goes on a date with a woman he's been seeing, who's a rather older than him, Jewish woman. They're in a restaurant, and this young man sees some of his friends from the military in the restaurant. And he's so immediately embarrassed to be seen to be with this older Jewish woman, because that he knows what they're thinking of her. He knows what they're thinking of him for being with her. And she makes, as it were, the mistake at the dinner of trying to be less Jewish. That is, to look more like everyone else and behave more like everyone else. And this aggravates and angers the man who she's on the date with even more, until he actually smacks her in front of everyone. It's this enormously insightful scene because, of course, the woman cannot do anything right. If she's Jewish, she's going to embarrass him. If she tries to be assimilated, she embarrasses him. There's no way out. It's what in chess they call a Zugzwang. You have to move, but every move will make your position worse. And the second book, which I think, to my mind, is too little appreciated on this matter, is perhaps the greatest novel of the 20th century, Life and Fate by Vasily Grossman. Do any of you know this book? Life and Fate was written by Vasily Grossman. Was a truly great writer along the lines of Tolstoy, Dostoevsky. He absolutely deserves to be up there. He was a journalist. He covered everything from the Battle of Stalingrad to, he was the first journalist in Treblinka. And my word, his essay on his reporting of being in Treblinka first is something which makes the blood run cold. It's an extraordinary piece of reporting. But Life and Fate was his masterpiece, and we almost didn't get it. There was one copy smuggled out of Soviet Russia. It's about 800 or 900 pages long, which is why a lot of people don't make it all the way through. But it covers the dark heart of the 20th century, from Stalingrad to Auschwitz and back. It's filled with unbelievable moments, just moments of drama I talk all evening about. But one of the most fascinating things about Life and Fate is that at the very dead center of the novel, Vasily Grossman gives 3 pages of his time and attention to the question of anti-Semitism. And structurally, morally, and in every other sense, it makes total sense, because he realizes that the dark heart of the 20th century actually hinges on this question. And it's at the dead center of the novel, and at the midnight of the 20th century. I urge you, if you don't read Life and Fate in its totality, read those 3 pages. He says, among other things, he says of anti-Semitism, he says, because of course, as everyone knows, it's a shape-shifting virus, as I said, assimilate, don't assimilate, still get anti-Semitism. If you're poor, get anti-Semitism. If you're rich, you get anti-Semitism. If you have no influence, you get anti-Semitism. If you have lots of influence, you get anti-Semitism. You don't have a state, you get anti-Semitism. If you have a state, you have anti-Semitism. On and on and on. Grossman makes this fascinating intellectual insight. He says, He gives this great list. He says you can find it in the Academy of Sciences and in the games children play in the schoolyard. But he says in every case it is the mirror of the dispossessed person who feels it. He says, tell me what you accuse the Jews of, and I'll tell you what you're guilty of. It's an incredibly important insight. There is no such thing as a happy anti-Semite. These are hate-filled, and by the way, not just hate-filled externally, but hate-filled to themselves. Everybody who looks for an excuse in life for their own failings can end up on the Jews, because they can offload their personal unhappiness, their personal thwartedness. I have a favorite passage of Nietzsche in the Genealogy of Morals, which I used very carefully, as you always do with Nietzsche in my latest book. They use the passage from the Genealogy of Morals where Nietzsche says of the person of resentment, who very often the person of resentment will fall into antisemitism. Nietzsche says there's a moment where you have to say to the person, there's one thing you have to say to the person of resentment, which is, yes, you are right. Somebody has destroyed your life. Somebody has ruined your life and the world entire. Person is you. But of course, even as Nietzsche says, it's very hard to find people to say that. Even Nietzsche doesn't know quite who would say it. He says a secular priest might stand over the life of the person of resentment and say it's you. But the resentful person is very likely to offload their resentment onto a successful person, or even not onto a successful person, to a people he might perceive to be successful. And to my mind, one of the reasons why anti-Semitism is ineradicable, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't tackle it wherever we see it. One of the reasons why I think it's ineradicable is because it plays to all of the worst human instincts, which are ineradicable. We will never get rid of human evil. We will never get rid of human envy, human dispossession, human weakness, human failing, the desire to offload your own failings onto others. We'll never get rid of these things. But we can shine a light on them. And when you shine a light on these things, you can certainly make some of the rats scurry away, which I regard as being among my professional pleasures.
Thank you, Mr. Murray.